The county clerk's office smelled of coal smoke and old paper. 14 lots had already sold, bottomland, half sections, standing houses, and the chairs in front were emptying as men with money folded their deeds and left. In the back row, a man with a stiff knee stood holding his hat, a tobacco tin pressing against his ribs through his coat. The auctioneer read the last lot, a limestone cave on a rocky hill. 7 acres that could not be plowed, grazed, or fenced. No one had bid on it in 3 previous sales. The auctioneer asked for $15. Silence. 12. Silence. 10. The man in the back said, 10. Every head in the room turned. Anson Pritchard had not planned to buy a cave. He had planned to buy seed corn, pay the balance on the freight judgment, and keep his rented claim through one more season. But plans require money, and money requires corn, and corn requires rain, and rain had not come to Chautauqua County in any quantity worth measuring for 2 years running. The sheriff's sale took place on a Wednesday in late January of 1890, inside the county clerk's office in Cedar Vale, Kansas, where the coal stove fought the drafts and lost. 14 lots went up. Farms, mostly. Broken leases and forfeited claims from men who had bet on the soil and found the soil indifferent to their wagers. Anson stood in the back with his hat in his hands because he could not afford to sit in the chairs reserved for bidders with money. He had $11.40 in a tobacco tin inside his coat. He had a lame mule named Button tied to the rail outside. He had a cracked wagon, 1 iron ice saw, 2 ice tongs, a bedroll, and a reputation for being stubborn enough to starve before asking anyone for charity. He was 64 years old. His right knee had not bent properly since a wagon tongue snapped on a rutted road outside Wichita and pinned him to the frozen ground for 2 hours before a passing drover cut him loose. His wife, Nell, had been dead 11 years. His 2 sons had gone to Colorado and stopped writing. His last milk cow had sold for $6 the previous week, which was $3 less than she was worth and $3 more than anyone in town was willing to pay for anything belonging to Anson Pritchard. The lots sold fast. A quarter section of bottomland went for $42 to a man from Independence who already owned the adjacent parcel. A half section with a standing house went for $67. Anson watched the numbers climb past anything he could touch. He was not there to buy land. He was there because he had nowhere else to be. His lease had ended. His landlord had filed in county court. The judgment said Anson owed $31 in back rent and freight damages, and until he paid it, leaving the county meant a warrant. Then the auctioneer read the last lot. A limestone cave parcel on the south edge of a rocky hill 2 miles from town. 7 acres of scrub grass, exposed rock, and a natural cavern that opened into the hillside like a mouth that had forgotten how to close. The land could not be plowed. The grass was too thin for grazing. The hill was too steep for building. The cave was too damp for storage, or so the county assessor had written in his notes. No one had bid on it in 3 previous sales. The auctioneer asked for $15. Silence. He asked for 12. Silence. He asked for 10 and looked ready to move on. Anson said, 10. Every head in the room turned. Not because the bid was large, because the man making it had nothing. Men who owe $31 and own a lame mule do not buy caves. They beg relatives for passage west or hire themselves out for winter wages. They do not raise their hands at auction for 7 acres of limestone and darkness. The clerk wrote the deed. Anson counted out $10 coins from the tobacco tin. That left him $1.40. The clerk looked at the coins, looked at Anson, and said nothing that needed saying. Outside, the cold hit like a wall. January in southern Kansas was not Maine cold, not the deep, patient freeze that turned the Kennebec River into a white highway. But it was enough. The wind came flat across the prairie and found every gap in a man's coat. Anson untied Button, who shifted her weight off her bad foreleg and regarded him with the resigned patience of an animal that has learned not to expect improvement. He had bought a cave. He had $1.40. He had no seed, no roof, no standing arrangement with any store or neighbor in Cedar Vale. And he had a plan that he had not spoken aloud to anyone because speaking it aloud would confirm what the entire town already suspected, that Anson Pritchard had lost his mind along with his money. Kapershify boy. The first man to tell Anson he was finished was Dr. Fenner Ladd, and he said it with the particular authority of a man who had spent 30 years watching people die from decisions exactly like this one. Ladd was 58, county physician, former Army contract surgeon who had treated heat stroke in Arizona, dysentery along the Canadian River, and frostbite in every fort north of Topeka. He carried a leather bag that smelled of carbolic acid and opinions that smelled of certainty. He found Anson 2 days after the sale, camped inside the cave mouth with a fire built against the limestone wall, and Button hobbled on the thin grass outside. Ladd did not dismount. He sat his horse and looked at the fire, the bedroll, the mule, and the old man crouched between them like a problem that had not yet decided which category of death it preferred. "You bought this," Ladd said. It was not a question. "I did." "With what remains of your money?" What remained was not enough for anything else. Ladd shifted in the saddle. His breath came out white. "Pritchard, I have treated men who froze in November because they would not leave a bad claim. I have treated men who starved in April because they planted when they should have walked. I have treated men who went into caves and never came out because the air was wrong, or the water rose, or the ceiling let go." He paused. "I have never treated a man who bought a cave with his last $10 and expected it to save him." Anson fed a stick to the fire. The limestone above him glowed orange where the heat touched it and stayed dark everywhere else. "I do not expect it to save me." "Then what do you expect?" "I expect it to hold what I put in it." Ladd stared at him. The answer made no sense, which was precisely the reaction Anson had anticipated. Ladd was a man of instruments and temperatures and measurable decline. He understood fever charts and wound drainage and the specific gravity of a man's prospects. What he did not understand, what no one in Cedar Vale understood, was ice. "Cold caves cure nothing," Ladd said. "Men die from hunger, thirst, and fever. You cannot eat darkness." Anson said nothing. He watched the fire shadows climb the limestone and thought about his father's hands, scarred and thick from decades of handling frozen blocks, pressing a 7-year-old boy's palm into a pile of dry pine sawdust inside a dark shed in Maine, and saying words that had traveled 40 years through memory without losing a single edge. Ladd rode away. Anson did not watch him go. He was already looking deeper into the cave, past the firelight, into the passage where the air changed temperature, and the walls wept with moisture that was not rain. The cave was not large by the standards of the limestone formations that riddled the Osage cuestas and Flint Hills of eastern Kansas. Geologists from the State Survey had mapped more than 100 such caverns in the Pennsylvanian rock, and many were deeper, wider, and more spectacular. Anson's cave was modest. The entrance was 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, narrowing to a passage that bent left after 30 feet and opened into a second chamber roughly 14 by 20 feet, with a ceiling high enough for a tall man to stand without stooping. Beyond that, a low crawl led to a third space that Anson never entered because the ceiling dropped to 2 feet and the floor was wet. But the second chamber was dry. The The floor was packed limestone rubble. The walls were solid. And on the first night Anson slept there, he noticed something that changed everything. The entrance breathed. When the outside temperature dropped, warmer air pushed out of the cave mouth. When the outside warmed at dawn, cooler air settled inside. But 30 feet in, past the bend, the air stopped moving. The second chamber sat still. Constant. A thermometer borrowed from Dooling's store. Anson left a nickel on the counter and took it without asking, because asking meant explaining, read 44 degrees at dawn. At noon, with January's sun warming the hillside above, it read 45. At dusk, 44 again. 44 degrees, while the outside air swung from 12 above zero at night to 38 in the afternoon. The cave did not care what the sky was doing. The limestone held its own counsel. And Anson Pritchard, who had cut pond ice along the Kennebec River from the age of 9 until the age of 26, who had watched his father Elam pack ice under pine shavings in sheds so dark you could not see your own boots, who had loaded ice onto barges and wagons and freight cars, and watched it arrive in cities 100 miles south, still solid, still cold, still ringing when you struck it with a pick. Anson Pritchard looked at that thermometer and saw not a number, but a vault. His father had taught him the laws of ice with the patience of a man explaining gravity to a stone. Ice did not need to be made, it needed to be kept. Heat was the enemy, but heat was lazy. It traveled through air, through water, through contact. Block all three paths, and the cold stayed. The ice endured. Elam had shown him how to slope a floor so meltwater drained instead of pooling, because standing water conducted heat into the stack like a wick into a flame. He had shown him how dry sawdust, packed tight, trapped air in tiny pockets that refused to carry warmth. He had shown him how a door, a real door, sealed tight, with a second door behind it, kept the cold from pouring out every time a man walked in. Ice was not preserved by cold alone. It was preserved by stillness, dryness, darkness, and drainage. The cave already had 3 of the 4. Anson would supply the rest. The plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. He would cut ice from the Big Caney River while winter held. He would haul it on the cracked wagon behind Button 2 blocks at a time because that was all the mule could pull on the frozen ruts. He would stack it in the second chamber, tight as masonry. He would bury it under 4 feet of dry sawdust mixed with prairie hay. He would build a double-doored vestibule at the passage bend. He would seal every crack with burlap and mud. He would cut a drainage trench from the chamber floor to a natural seam in the rock that led downhill. And in July, when the sun turned every cabin into an oven and every root cellar into a warm bath and every well into a lukewarm disappointment, Anson Pritchard would have the only cold place within 40 miles of Cedar Vale, if the ice lasted, if the cave held, if his body did not break first. The blocks needed to be 24 by 36 inches, 8 to 10 inches thick. At full thickness, each weighed between 200 and 300 pounds. He needed 200 blocks to fill the chamber properly. 200 blocks. 1 mule. 1 man with a bad knee and an iron saw that had last been sharpened in 1886. He started cutting on the 1st of February. Martha Dooling was the first person to visit the cave who was not there to mock him or diagnose him. She was 42, the storekeeper's sister, a farm widow who had buried a husband, 2 calves, and a sod roof in the same year, and come out of it with the particular clarity of a woman who has stopped expecting life to be fair and started expecting it to make sense. She ran the dry goods side of Dooling's store, kept the ledger, ordered the stock, and tolerated her brother's opinions with a patience that stopped exactly at the point where tolerance became agreement. She arrived on a gray afternoon in early February, driving a buckboard with a crate of salt pork and a sack of cornmeal in the back. She did not say why she had come. She set the crate on a flat rock near the cave mouth and watched Anson drag a block of river ice across the dirt on a pair of cottonwood skids. "You're filling a cave with ice," she said. Anson's breath came hard. The block weighed close to 250 pounds, and the skids caught on every stone. "I am." "Why?" He stopped pulling. His arms ached from shoulders to wrists. His knee throbbed in the specific way that meant he had about 2 more hours of hauling before it would refuse to bear his weight entirely. He looked at Martha dueling and made a decision that was either trust or exhaustion. He could not tell the difference anymore. "Come inside," he said. He showed her the second chamber. He held the borrowed thermometer against the wall and let her read it. 44 degrees. Outside, the air was 31. He explained nothing. He waited. "That is steady?" she asked. "Morning and night, sun and cloud. It does not change." Martha looked at the empty chamber, the chalk marks on the walls where Anson had measured the stacking area, the shallow trench he had begun cutting with a hand chisel. She was not a woman who required things to be explained when the evidence was present, but she was a woman who required things to be tested. "If you pack ice in here and bury it," she said, "why will it not melt by May?" "It will melt some. It always melts some. The question is how fast." "And how fast is that?" Anson picked up 2 chunks of broken ice from the morning's cutting. Each was roughly the size of a man's head. He set one on a patch of wet prairie hay near the entrance. He set the other on a mound of dry sawdust he had swept from the chamber floor. "Come back tomorrow morning," he said. "Look at both." Martha came back. The chunk on wet hay had softened to a gray slush that leaked into the dirt. The chunk on dry sawdust was still hard. When she rapped it with her knuckle, it rang. She stood there for a moment, looking at the 2 results side by side. Then she looked at Anson. "Wet conducts," she said. "Dry does not." "My father would have liked you." Martha did not smile, but something shifted behind her eyes. She picked up the salt pork and the cornmeal and carried them into the cave without being asked. She set them on a ledge near the entrance, away from the damp wall. "I'm not giving these to you," she said. "I'm storing them here because my brother's storeroom has rats. You may eat what the rats would have eaten. The rest is mine." It was the most elegant act of charity Anson had ever received, because it was not charity at all. It was a woman deciding that a cave with a steady temperature might be useful, and that the man inside it might not be entirely insane. But Martha's conversion, if it could be called that, was private. She did not tell her brother. She did not tell the women at church. She came twice a week, checked the temperature, checked the ice, and said nothing to anyone. When asked about the cornmeal and salt pork she had loaded into the buckboard, she said she was storing it at a neighbor's to keep it from the rats. This was technically true. Anson was a neighbor. The cave had no rats. "Why bury winter inside a hill when summer will find it anyway?" she had asked on that first visit. The question was reasonable. The answer would take months, but Martha Dooling was willing to watch. Ransom Peale was not willing to watch. Ransom Peale was willing to act. Peale was 49, broad across the shoulders from years of hauling freight, narrow across the conscience from years of selling it at whatever price the market's desperation would bear. He owned Peale Cold Room, the only reliable summer ice connection in Cedar Vale. His arrangement was simple. The railroad brought blocks from commercial ice houses farther north, packed in sawdust and straw, and delivered them to the depot every 2 weeks from May through September. Peale bought them at depot price, stored them in his thick-walled stone building behind the livery, and sold them at whatever the heat demanded. In a mild summer, ice went for 10 cents a pound. In a brutal one, it went for 25. Peel's customers were the hotel, the two saloons, the butcher, and families with sick children who had no other way to bring a fever down. He did not set the price out of cruelty. He set it out of mathematics. He was the only man with cold, and cold in July was worth whatever a desperate person would pay. When Peel heard that Anson Pritchard was hauling river ice into a limestone cave 2 miles from town, he did not laugh. Laughing was for men who did not understand what a monopoly was or how one broke. Peel understood both. He rode out to the cave on a February afternoon with 2 men who worked his warehouse. They sat their horses and watched Anson wrestle a block across the frozen ground on skids, while buttons stamped and blew against the cold. "Pritchard," Peel said. Anson did not stop pulling. "Peel, you are storing what I sell, old man." Anson got the block to the cave mouth and stood up, breathing hard. His hands were cracked along every knuckle. His right glove had split at the thumb. "Then sell it honest," he said. Peel leaned forward in the saddle. "Honest? In July, ice belongs to the man who still has it. That is the most honest thing on the plains." "I expect to still have it." Peel looked at the cave, the mule, the cracked wagon, the old man with the bad knee. He calculated what every businessman calculates, not whether the threat was real, but whether it could become real if left alone. A healthy man with a team of horses and a proper ice house might store enough to undercut Peel's summer trade. An aging cripple with a lame mule and a hole in a hill was something else. But Peel had not kept his monopoly by ignoring threats that looked harmless. "I will give you $5 for the deed," Peel said. "That is half what you paid, but you have eaten into your investment already. Take it. Buy passage to Winfield. Start clean." "No, Pritchard." Peel's voice dropped the way a man's voice drops when he's done pretending to be friendly. "I have the railroad contract. I have the stone room. I have the customers. You have a mule and a dream. Do not make me spend effort on you." "Effort costs nothing to a man who has plenty." Peel stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward town. His 2 men followed. None of them looked back. Within a week, the rumor started. Peel told men at the livery that the cave water was tainted, that limestone seepage carried sickness, that anyone who breathed the air would catch lung fever, that the county had considered condemning the parcel before the sale. None of this was true. But truth was not the currency Peel traded in. He traded in doubt, and doubt was cheap and durable. Dr. Ladd did not endorse the rumor. He was too principled for that, but he did not deny it either, because his own dismissal of the cave lent it credibility. When women at the church asked whether cave air was dangerous, Ladd said, "I would not store food in a place where water sweats from the walls." He meant it as medical caution. Peel used it as evidence. The pressure tightened like a rope. The sawmill foreman, who sold dry sawdust by the sack for a few cents, told Anson that cash payment was now required in advance. No credit, no promises, no exceptions. Anson had 40 cents left after buying the thermometer and a pound of nails. Dry sawdust cost 3 cents a sack. He could buy 13 sacks. He needed more than 100. The supply line was cut before the work was half finished. If you have ever built something that no one around you understood, if you have ever kept working while the people who should have helped you walked the other way, tell us in the comments. Because what Anson did next is the part that separates the people who quit from the people who find another road. 2 days after the sawmill shut him out, Anson found 4 sacks of dry sawdust stacked against the cave entrance at dawn. No note, no name. The sacks were the same type used at Dooling's store. Coarse burlap with a stamped circle on the flap. When Anson went to the store that afternoon to buy a penny's worth of salt, Martha was behind the counter. She did not look at him differently. She did not mention sawdust. She weighed the salt and wrapped it in brown paper and said, "The weather's turning. You should work faster." He worked faster. The calendar was his enemy now. February in southern Kansas was not reliable. Some years the river stayed frozen through March. Other years a warm spell cracked the ice in mid-February and turned the cutting grounds into gray slush. Anson had no way to predict which year this would be, and no margin for error. Each morning he rose before dawn, fed Button a half ration of oats. The supply was dwindling, and a mule that stops eating stops pulling, and walked to the river. The Big Caney was not a large river, but in January and February it froze deep enough in the slow bends for cutting. He had scored the surface with a borrowed plow blade, scratching lines 24 inches apart in one direction and 36 in the other, creating a grid that looked from the bank like a giant had drawn a checkerboard on the water. The iron ice saw was 40 years old. His father had used it on the Kennebec. The teeth were still sharp because Anson filed them every evening by firelight, the way Elam had taught him, 3 strokes per tooth, always pushing away from the body. The saw bit into the ice with a sound like tearing cloth. Each cut took 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the thickness. 8 inches was workable. 10 inches was ideal. Less than 7, and the blocks cracked when he levered them out. He cut in the mornings when the ice was hardest. By noon, the sun softened the surface, and the saw wandered. He learned to stop at midday and haul what he had cut. 2 blocks on the wagon was all Button could manage on the frozen ruts. The distance from the river bend to the cave was 1.25 miles. Each round trip took close to an hour. On a good day, he made 6 trips, 12 blocks. On the first day, he cut 12 blocks and broke 3, 9 stored. His hands bled through his gloves by the 3rd cut. By the end of the first week, he had 47 blocks stacked in the second chamber. The stacking was crude. He did not yet have enough sawdust to insulate properly, so he packed broken ice chips between the blocks and covered the top with hay. The hay was not ideal. Hay held moisture. Moisture conducted heat. But hay was free, and sawdust was not, and a man with 40 cents could not afford to be particular about everything. His knee swelled until it looked like something that belonged on a different body. He wrapped it with strips torn from a shirt that had already served as a towel, a bandage, and a rag for cleaning the saw. He ate Martha's salt pork sparingly, 1 piece at dawn and 1 at dark, supplemented with whatever he could scavenge: a rabbit caught in a snare, a handful of dried corn from a field that had been harvested months ago and still held scattered kernels in the frozen dirt. The cold was his ally and his torturer. It kept the river solid. It kept the ice cuttable. It also froze the mud on his boots into iron, stiffened his fingers until the saw handle felt like a club, and sent pain through his bad knee like a nail driven in with every step. Some mornings he stood at the cave mouth and watched his breath freeze and calculated whether his body had enough days left in it to finish the job. He did not know the answer. He cut ice anyway. By the 3rd week of February, the weather betrayed him. A warm rain came from the south on a Thursday night. Not a long rain, not a heavy one, but enough to soften the top inch of river ice and turn the scored grid lines into vague suggestions. When Anson went to cut the next morning, his saw slipped sideways on the first stroke and the blade caught in a crack that had not been there the day before. He tried a different section. The ice held, but it groaned when he stepped on it, and groaning ice was ice that was thinking about giving way. He moved to the center of the bend where the water was shallow and the freeze was deepest. He cut 1 block, started on the second. The ice shifted under his boots. He went through to his waist. The water was not deep, 3 feet, maybe less. But the cold was absolute. It hit his legs like a hammer made of nothing. His body seized. His hands locked on the saw handle. For a moment he could not move, could not breathe, could not think of anything except the color of the water closing around him, green-black and ancient. He dragged himself out by jamming the saw blade into solid ice and pulling with both arms. He lay on the surface, shaking, soaked from the waist down, and stared at the sky until the shaking became controllable. Then he got up, loaded the 1 block onto the wagon, and drove Button back to the cave. Dr. Ladd appeared that evening. Whether someone had seen the fall or whether Ladd had simply been checking on his favorite patient was unclear. He found Anson inside the cave, wrapped in every piece of cloth he owned, sitting beside a fire that was too small to warm anything but his pride. Ladd examined him with the brisk efficiency of a man who has treated 1,000 men who refuse to take care of themselves. He checked the knee. He checked the fingers. He pressed his ear to Anson's chest and listened for the wet rattle that meant lung trouble. "You fell through," Ladd said. "I went through. Falling implies I was not paying attention." "The distinction is academic when you are dead." Ladd straightened up. "Your heart will quit before your cave learns to freeze, Pritchard." "My heart has been quitting for 64 years. It has not managed it yet." Ladd looked at the stacked ice blocks in the second chamber. 47 neat blocks, plus the day's single edition, plus broken chunks packed into the gaps along the walls. A thermometer hung from a nail on the wall above the stack. It read 43 degrees. Ladd looked at the thermometer for a long time. "That is steady?" he asked. "It was 44 when I hung it. It has dropped 1 degree since I added the ice." Ladd said nothing. He packed his bag, left a small bottle of liniment on the ledge beside Martha's remaining salt pork, and rode away without offering the verdict that Anson could see forming behind his eyes. Something had shifted. Not much. A crack in the certainty. The kind of crack that lets a man wonder, for just a moment, whether the fool he is watching might know something he does not. But Ladd said none of this. He said, "Stay off the river until the ice is solid again." Anson waited 2 days. The cold returned. The river refroze. He went back to cutting. 89 blocks stored. The sawdust supply was running out again. The hay was getting damp near the back wall, where a seam in the rock let moisture weep through. Winter was ending, and the second chamber was barely half full. The calendar said March was coming. March in Kansas meant anything. Blizzards, warm spells, tornadoes, nothing at all. The only certainty was that the cutting season was almost over. Anson needed 100 more blocks. He had perhaps 3 weeks. His body was a ledger of damage, swollen knee, cracked hands, a cough that came and went like a creditor who had not yet decided to collect. Button's bad foreleg was worse. The wagon axle had developed a sound that suggested a conversation between wood and failure. And somewhere in the dark second chamber, 89 blocks of river ice sat under hay and sawdust and waited to find out whether they would last until July or melt into a puddle that proved every laughing man in Cedar Vale right. The cave held its breath. The old man held his. He found help where he did not look for it, and it arrived in a shape he did not expect. The Molina brothers showed up on a Saturday morning in late February, driving a wagon with a cracked tongue that dragged in the frozen mud like a broken limb. Anton was 26. Jarek was 23. They were Czech, from a village near Plzeň whose name Anson could not pronounce and did not try to. They had come to Kansas 2 years earlier with $80, a crate of tools, and the specific kind of hope that belongs to men who have never been told that hope is insufficient collateral. Their wagon tongue had split on the Cedar Vale road. No one in town had offered to fix it. Anson did not know whether this was because Czech immigrants did not merit charity or because the tongue was badly cracked and the repair would take half a day. He suspected both. Anson looked at the tongue. He looked at the brothers. He said, "I have a brace and iron strap. It will hold if you do not load past 400 pounds. He spent 3 hours fixing the tongue while Anton and Jarek watched him work. They did not speak much English. Anson did not speak any Czech, but hands working on wood do not require translation, and by the time Anson had bolted the iron strap around the splice, the brothers understood two things. The old man knew how to fix what was broken, and the old man expected nothing in return. They came back the next morning with the repaired wagon and gestured toward the river. They did not believe in the cave. They did not understand why a man would fill a hill with frozen water, but they believed in paying labor with labor, and the tongue repair was worth at least a day's hauling. That day, with 2 wagons and 3 men, Anson moved 22 blocks, more than he had managed in any previous 3 days combined. The brothers worked without complaint, without understanding, and without the hesitation that comes from thinking a task is foolish. They hauled because hauling was the job, and the job had been offered. They came back twice more that week. Then the planting preparations called them away to their own claim, and Anson was alone again. But those 3 days had changed the math. 131 blocks stored, 69 to go, and February was not finished. Rowan Tate found the cave the way certain men find certain places, not by looking, but by recognizing something that had been looking for them. He was 71 years old, thin as a fence rail, with hands that shook when they were empty and steadied when they held a tool. He had been a brewery cellar foreman in St. Louis for 23 years, managing the underground vaults where lager aged in oak barrels at temperatures that never varied by more than 2 degrees from October to April. He knew stone the way a ship captain knows water, by feel, by sound, by the way it breathed when the season turned. After the brewery closed, he had traveled between towns repairing spring houses, beer cellars, and stone-lined wells. He had no family left. He slept in freight sheds and church porches and the empty stalls of livery stables whose owners did not check the back corners after dark. He came to Cedar Vale following a rumor about a stone cistern that needed repointing. The cistern job paid $1.50 and took 2 days. On the 3rd day, with nowhere particular to go, he walked the road south of town and saw the cave. What stopped him was not the cave itself. It was the chalk marks on the wall just inside the entrance. Someone had drawn lines at measured intervals, not the scratches of idle carving, but the deliberate marks of a man planning airflow. Arrows showing direction, numbers showing distance. A diagram of a door frame with measurements written in a hand that shook from cold or age, but did not waver from precision. Rowan stepped inside. He followed the passage to the bend. He saw the stacked ice, 130-odd blocks packed tight with hay and sawdust between them, the pile rising nearly to the ceiling of the second chamber. He saw the trench that Anson had chiseled into the floor, running from the base of the stack toward a crack in the far wall. He saw the thermometer. He read it. Then he heard the sound of a man cursing a mule, and he walked back outside to find Anson Pritchard trying to unload a block from the wagon while Button refused to stand still on the frozen slope. The block slid. Anson tried to catch it with the tongs. The tongs slipped. 300 pounds of river ice came off the wagon bed and landed on Anson's right boot, the one that protected the bad knee. He went down with a sound that was not a scream and not a word, but something between the two that meant his body had finally delivered the message his mind had been refusing to read. Rowan did not rush to help. He walked to the trench inside the cave, crouched beside it, and ran his finger along the cut. Then he walked back outside, where Anson sat in the dirt with his boot pinned under the block and his face the color of old ash. "You remembered the ice," Rowan said. "You forgot the water." Anson looked up at him. Pain and confusion competed for control of his expression. "What?" "Your trench slope's wrong near the east wall. Meltwater will pool there by April. Pool long enough and the sawdust turns to paste, and paste conducts heat faster than bare stone." Rowan bent down and worked the ice block off Anson's boot with a leverage trick that involved the tongs, a flat rock, and an understanding of fulcrums that came from decades of moving barrels in tight spaces. "The ice is good. The stacking is rough but sound. The insulation is thin, but the drainage will kill you before the heat does." Anson flexed his foot. Nothing was broken, but the bruise would turn his ankle purple for a week. He looked at the old man standing over him, thin, shaking, sharp-eyed. Wearing a coat that had been patched so many times, the original fabric was a matter of philosophical debate. "Who are you?" Anson asked. "Rowan Tate. I kept beer cold in St. Louis for 23 years. Before that, I kept ice for a man in Quincy who sold it to riverboats. Before that, I was young and stupid, but that is not relevant to your drainage problem." Anson got to his feet. His knee screamed. His ankle throbbed. His pride, which had been operating on fumes for weeks, recognized something in Rowan's voice that was not pity and not mockery, but the specific tone of a man who sees competent work done badly and cannot walk past it. "Show me the drainage," Anson said. Rowan showed him. He poured a bucket of water near the east wall, and they watched it flow. Instead of running down the trench toward the natural drain, it pooled in a shallow depression where the chisel work had followed the grain of the rock instead of fighting it. A cup of standing water, maybe 2 cups. Enough to soften the bottom layer of sawdust within a week. Enough to start a chain of heat conduction that would eat the ice from below, while Anson watched the top and saw nothing wrong. "You cut with the stone," Rowan said. "You need to cut against it here. 2 inches deeper on the east side. Use a flat chisel, not a point." He did not ask permission to stay. He picked up Anson's chisel, knelt beside the trench, and began cutting. His hands shook until the chisel bit stone, and then they were as steady as the rock itself. Rowan stayed, not because he was asked and not because he had nowhere else to go, although both were true. He stayed because the cave was the first proper cold storage project he had seen in 3 years, and a man who has spent his life keeping things cold does not walk past a cold room that needs fixing any more than a surgeon walks past a wound. He could not lift much. His back had surrendered that capacity years ago, but he could see what Anson could not, and what he saw was a dozen small errors that would compound into failure by summer. The drainage trench was the first correction. Rowan lined it with flat pieces of limestone, fitted tight, so the meltwater ran in a clean channel instead of seeping into the floor rubble. He demonstrated by pouring water at the high end and making Anson watch it travel the full length to the natural crack in the far wall, where it disappeared into the hillside. The water moved fast and clean, no pooling, no hesitation. "Meltwater is the thief," Rowan said. "Air you can block. Sun you can block. But water goes where it wants, and wherever it goes, it takes cold with it and leaves warm behind." The second correction was the doors. Anson had planned 1 door at the bend in the passage. Rowan said 1 door was an invitation to failure. Every time that door opened, cold air, which was heavy and sat on the floor like an invisible lake, would pour out past a man's ankles and be replaced by warm air rushing in overhead. 1 door meant that every visit spent cold the way a hole in a bucket spends water. They built 2 doors, planks from a dismantled fence Anson had found on the abandoned claim next to his. Rowan measured the passage and cut the frames himself, working slowly because his hands required negotiation for every precise movement. The first door sat at the bend. The second sat 6 feet deeper, just before the chamber opened up. Between them was a vestibule, a dead space where a man could close one door behind him before opening the next. An airlock. The same principle that brewery cellars in St. Louis had used for decades, scaled down to one man and one hill. The third correction was the stacking. Anson had layered sawdust thickly between each row of ice blocks. Rowan said this was wrong. Between the blocks, the sawdust needed to be thin, just enough to keep the ice from freezing into one solid mass, which would crack and create channels for meltwater. The thick insulation belonged on top and on the sides where the heat came from. 4 feet of dry sawdust above the stack, 4 feet on each side, thin between the rows. The blocks themselves, packed tight, were their own best insulation. A solid mass of ice lost surface area the same way a large animal loses heat less than a small one. The fourth correction was the entry threshold. Rowan built up the stone sill at the inner door so that it stood 8 inches above the floor. Cold air, being heavy, would settle below the sill. When a man opened the door, the cold pool stayed inside instead of pouring over the threshold and down the passage. A dam for air that behaved like water. Each lesson came through action, not lecture. Rowan did not explain the physics of heat transfer in words that Anson could have read in a book. He poured water and showed where it pooled. He opened a door and held a candle flame at ankle height to show how the cold air moved. He placed his hand on the stone above the ice and on the stone 3 feet away and made Anson feel the difference. The cave was his classroom, and every surface in it was a teaching aid. "Cold falls," Rowan said one evening, sitting outside the cave mouth while the sun went down and the air turned sharp. "Water leaves. Men remember. That is everything I learned in 23 years of keeping cellars." Anson wrote the words on the inside of the inner door frame with a piece of chalk. He did not ask whether Rowan would stay for the rest of the winter. The question would have implied that staying was optional, and both men had silently agreed that it was not. March came in cold and left warm. They worked through every day that the weather allowed. Anson cut the final blocks in the first week of March, racing a thaw that crept up the river like a slow fire. He fell through the ice once more, up to his thighs this time, in shallow water, more indignity than danger, and after that, the river was finished. No more cutting. Whatever he had stored would be the total. 186 usable blocks, plus broken chunks packed into every void along the walls and ceiling. Rowan estimated the total weight at somewhere near 30 tons. They sealed the top with 4 feet of mixed dry sawdust and prairie hay. Rowan insisted on removing every handful of sawdust that felt even slightly damp, replacing it with dry material that Martha Dooling continued to deliver in burlap sacks that appeared at the cave mouth without explanation or attribution. They nailed burlap over every visible crack in the vestibule walls. They mixed mud with dry grass and packed it into the gaps around both door frames. They tested the doors by opening and closing them while watching the candle flame at the inner threshold. When the flame did not flicker, Rowan said the seal was adequate. When it wavered, they found the leak and packed it. The last task was the drainage check. Rowan poured 6 buckets of water onto the sawdust pile from different positions, and they waited. Within an hour, the water had filtered through the sawdust, run across the packed ice surface, found the trench, and exited through the natural drain. No pooling, no standing water. The system breathed slowly, like a sleeping animal, losing water and keeping cold. On the 12th of March, Anson nailed the last burlap strip over the outer door. Rowan hung a second thermometer at the inner door, chest height, so they could check the temperature without entering the chamber and spending cold on curiosity. The first readings, taken on a Sunday in late March, drew a map of hope. Outside, late afternoon, 68 degrees. Cave entrance, 56 degrees. Inner chamber above the sawdust, 41 degrees. Meltwater channel, steady trickle, not a flood. Top sawdust, dry, except near one wall seam where limestone moisture seeped, which Rowan packed with an extra foot of hay. The numbers meant nothing to anyone who had not spent a winter hauling ice into a hill. They meant everything to Anson. 41 degrees. The stack was holding. The insulation was working. The doors were sealed. The drainage was running clean. But March was not July. March was a promise. July was the test. Dr. Ladd returned in April. He said the temperature readings meant nothing until real heat arrived. Martha said she would believe the cave worked when butter stayed hard inside it. Peel told anyone who listened that the old man had built a cellar, not a miracle, and that all cellars failed in Kansas summers. None of them were entirely wrong. A cellar was not an ice house. A cool cave was not a cold room. The difference between 41 degrees and 70 degrees was the difference between preservation and decay, between a child's fever breaking and a child's fever climbing, between meat that lasted and meat that killed. April was kind. May was warmer. The question was whether the cave would still be cold in the months when cold was the rarest commodity on the prairie. Spring rains failed. The grass came up thin and pale. By May, the creek banks showed mud that cracked into plates like broken pottery. By June, the Big Caney ran low enough to walk across without wetting your knees. The creek that fed the nearest farm smelled of algae and warmed in the sun until cattle refused to drink from the shallow pools. Women began cooking before dawn, because by noon, the kitchen stove turned every cabin into a box of trapped heat that did not cool until well after dark. Rowan checked the cave thermometer every Sunday, dawn and dusk. He recorded the numbers with a carpenter's pencil on a board nailed to the vestibule wall. April 15th. Inner chamber, 42 degrees. Outside high, 74. May 1st. Inner chamber, 43 degrees. Outside high, 81. May 15th. Inner chamber, 43 degrees. Outside high, 89. June 1st. Iju. Inner chamber, 44 degrees. Outside high, 96. The ice was melting. Of course it was melting. Ice always melts. The question was never whether it would melt, but how slowly, and Rowan's numbers told a story that even a skeptic would have found difficult to dismiss. The inner chamber had risen 3 degrees in 10 weeks. 3 degrees, while the outside world climbed 50. The meltwater trickle had increased, but it ran clear and steady through the trench and out the drain. The top sawdust remained dry in all but the corner near the wall seam where Rowan had added a second hay barrier. When Anson opened the inner door on the June 1st check, the air that met him was not winter cold, not the sharp bite of January or Sabt, but it was cool in a way that nothing else within 40 miles was cool. It was the coolness of a root cellar multiplied by 20. It was a room that remembered February while the rest of the world had forgotten it entirely. Rowan told Anson to stop opening the door. Every check cost ice. Every breath of warm air that entered cost cold that could not be replaced. The stored ice was like money in a locked bank, Rowan said. Every unnecessary opening spent it. Anson must not show off the chamber. He must not prove himself to anyone. The proof would come when it was needed, and not one moment before. "You're not saving ice for pride," Rowan said. "You're saving cold for July." Anson locked the inner door. He did not open it again for 6 weeks. July of 1890 arrived the way bad things arrive in Kansas. Not gradually, but all at once, as if the sky had decided to make a point. The heat came on the 6th of July. The wind, which had been blowing hot and dry from the southwest for a week, simply stopped. It did not taper. It did not shift. It stopped, the way a heartbeat stops, and the air that replaced it was not air, but a weight. People stepped outside and felt it press against their chests. Horses stood with their heads down and did not flick their tails. Dogs crawled under porches and stayed there. The sky was white, not cloudy, not hazy, just white, as if the blue had been boiled out of it. On the 7th of July, Anson's porch thermometer read 104 degrees at noon. By 2 in the afternoon, it read 108. A man at Dooling's store said his thermometer showed 110, but thermometers in direct sun lied, and everyone knew it. The shade temperature was bad enough. 108 in the shade was not weather. It was punishment. On the 8th of July, the temperature passed 112 on Anson's porch thermometer. The locals would later call it the Great Scorcher, though no official Weather Bureau record would carry the name. What the records would show, in the dry language of government stations, was that southern Kansas experienced a heat event in July of 1890 that killed livestock, collapsed wells, and sent families into creek beds to sleep on mud that was cooler than their cabins, only because mud holds the memory of water longer than wood holds the memory of shade. Chickens died under wagons. Their bodies stiffened in the dust, and no one moved them because moving anything in that heat cost more effort than the task returned. Milk soured before noon. Butter turned to yellow oil on the counter. Meat that had been fresh at breakfast was questionable by supper and dangerous by morning. The butcher lost half his stock in 2 days. He hung wet sheets over the remaining meat and watched the sheets dry in an hour. The wells held, but the water came up warm, not hot, not dangerous, but warm enough that drinking it did not cool the body. It was like drinking tea that had been left to sit. It satisfied thirst without relieving heat, and the difference between those two things became clearer with every hour. Peel's railroad ice arrived on the 8th bides, a delivery that had been scheduled for the 11th, but was moved up because the depot agent could see what was coming. The blocks came packed in sawdust and straw, and they were already smaller than they should have been because the journey from the commercial ice house had cost them a quarter of their mass. Peel stored them in his thick-walled cold room and began selling immediately. He sold to the hotel first, then the 2 saloons, then the butcher. By noon on the 9th, the commercial ice was gone. Peel had sold every piece at 20 cents a pound, which was double the normal summer rate and exactly as much as a desperate man would pay for something that might keep his family's food from poisoning them. When families with sick children came to the cold room that afternoon, Peel told them to wait for the next delivery. The next delivery was 3 days away. In 3 days, at 112 degrees, a child with heat fever could be dead. Dr. Ladd's niece was 6 years old. Her name was Clara. She had brown hair that her mother braided each morning and that came undone each afternoon because Clara could not sit still long enough for anything to stay finished. She collected feathers and lined them up on the porch rail by size. She named the chickens. She had been healthy every day of her life until the 9th of July, when the heat inside her family's cabin, a frame house with a shingled roof that absorbed the sun and held it like a coal, rose to the point where a small body could not shed warmth faster than the walls gave it back. Clara's mother found her on the kitchen floor at midday, not unconscious, not quite, but limp in a way that a 6-year-old should never be limp, as if the scaffolding inside her had softened. Her skin was hot and dry. She had stopped sweating, which was the sign that Ladd feared most, because a body that stopped sweating was a body that had given up regulating itself and was now simply cooking. Ladd did what medicine allowed. He soaked cloths in well water and wrapped her limbs, but the well water was warm. The cloths cooled her by 2 degrees, then absorbed her heat and became useless. He needed cold water. He needed ice. He needed the one thing that he had spent 5 months telling Anson Pritchard was worthless. He carried Clara himself. He wrapped her in a damp sheet, placed her in his buggy, and drove 2 miles south to the cave on the hill. The road was baked hard enough that the wheels barely raised dust. The horse moved slowly, head low, nostrils wide. Every living thing on the road was rationing its effort against the heat. When Lad arrived at the cave, he found a line. Not a long one, 7 people, maybe 8, standing in the thin shade of a cottonwood that was losing its leaves to drought. They were families from the nearest farms, women with children, an old man with a wet cloth over his head. The Molina brothers, standing silently, waiting for whatever came next. Anson stood at the outer door. He had not opened it. Lad climbed down from the buggy with Clara in his arms. The child's head rested against his shoulder. Her breath was shallow and fast, the way a bird breathes, and her eyes were open but not focused on anything that existed in the present moment. "Pritchard," Lad said. Anson looked at the child. He looked at Lad. 5 months of dismissal hung between them like heat haze. 5 months of "you cannot eat darkness," and "cold caves cure nothing," and "your heart will quit before your cave learns to freeze." The words were still in the air, as real as the temperature, and neither man pretended they were not. "Children and sick first," Anson said. "Rowan runs the doors." If you are watching this and your chest is tight right now, if you need to know whether that child lives, subscribe and stay with the story. Because what happens inside this cave is the moment that everything Anson built either holds or breaks. Rowan was already at the inner door. His cough had worsened in the summer heat, a sound like paper tearing deep in his chest, but his hands were steady on the latch, and his voice carried the particular authority of a man who has managed controlled environments for longer than most of the people present had been alive. 8 at a time, Rowan said. 1 door closes before the next opens. No one touches the sawdust. No one touches the ice. You cool in the air, that's all. He opened the outer door. The air that came through the gap was not cold, not the way a winter morning is cold, but it was different. It was cooler than anything the people standing in the July sun had felt in weeks. It moved through the crack like a slow exhalation, carrying the smell of damp limestone and sawdust and something older, something that had been sealed in the dark since February. It touched the faces of the people standing outside, and a woman holding a baby closed her eyes. Lad carried Clara through the outer door. Rowan closed it behind them. In the vestibule, the 6-foot space between the 2 doors, the temperature dropped from the inferno outside to what the thermometer on the vestibule wall read as 61 degrees. Lad felt the change on his forearms. Clara shifted in his arms. Rowan opened the inner door. The air from the second chamber rolled over them like water, not cold enough to shock, not warm enough to disappoint. The thermometer at chest height read 47 degrees. Outside, the world was 112. Inside the hill, in the room that Anson had filled with river ice and buried under 4 feet of sawdust, the air was 47 degrees, and still and dark and waiting. Lad set Clara on a blanket that Anson had spread on the floor near the wall, away from the sawdust pile. He soaked a cloth in the water that trickled from the drain, cave-cooled meltwater, colder than anything in any well within 40 miles, and wrapped it around Clara's wrists and ankles and the back of her neck. The cloth stayed cold. It did not warm in minutes the way the well water cloths had. It stayed cold because the water feeding it was cold, and the air surrounding it was cold, and the stone beneath it was cold. And all of these things were cold because 6 months earlier, a man with a bad knee had dragged 200 blocks of frozen river into a hole in a hill and buried them under sawdust, and prayed to nothing in particular that the laws of physics would not change their mind. Clara's pulse slowed. Her breathing deepened. The color in her cheeks shifted from the bright flush of heat to something more human. After 20 minutes, she opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling and said, "It is dark." Lad let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. He put his hand on the stone wall above Clara's head. It was cool, not cold, not freezing, just cool, in a way that the word had almost lost its meaning outside. The limestone had absorbed the temperature of the ice and the earth and the insulation and was giving it back slowly, the way a good stove gives back heat, not all at once, but in a steady, patient distribution that did not depend on fuel or fire or anything except the physics of stone. Lad looked across the dim chamber at Anson, who stood near the inner door with his back to the wall and his hands at his sides. Anson did not say anything. He did not need to. The thermometer on the wall said it. The child breathing normally on the blanket said it. The cold air pooling around their ankles, too heavy to escape over the raised threshold, said it. "I told him men could not eat darkness," Lad said to no one in particular. His voice was quiet in the way that voices become quiet when a man is speaking to his own certainty and finding it insufficient. "I did not know darkness could hold winter." They ran the cave in shifts through the afternoon and into the evening. Rowan managed the doors with the precision of a man running a lock on a canal. 8 people entered the outer chamber. 1 door closed. The second opened. They sat or lay on blankets in the cool dark for 15 to 20 minutes, long enough to bring core temperatures down, not so long that the chamber warmed significantly from the accumulated body heat. Then out. Door closes. Door opens. Next group. Healthy men waited outside. Some sat under wet blankets. Some stood in the shade and said nothing. They watched the cave mouth the way people watch a well in a dry season, not with understanding, but with need. The vestibule temperature rose through the day as the outer door opened and closed. By mid-afternoon, the thermometer read 52 degrees in the vestibule and 47 in the inner chamber. The ice was spinning faster than Anson wanted. Each opening of the inner door caused cold that could not be replaced. But Rowan controlled the rhythm, and the chamber held. By nightfall, 37 people had passed through the outer chamber in rotations. 17 of them were children, 4 were elderly, 3 were sick. Clara, a farmhand with sun sickness who had stopped making sense that morning, and an old woman whose heart raced so fast that Lad could count the beats by watching the vein in her neck. All 3 improved in the cold air. None were cured. The cave was not a hospital. But the cold bought time, and time was what Lad needed to let the body's own defenses recover. Outside the cave, the world continued to burn. At Peel's cold room, the temperature inside the thick stone walls had risen to 88 degrees. Without ice, the room was just a room. Customers who had paid 20 cents a pound that morning had nothing to show for it. The butcher lost the rest of his hanging meat. A hired hand fainted behind the shop and lay in the dirt for an hour before anyone noticed. Ephraim Quill, a bachelor who lived alone in a cabin east of town, was found dead in the late afternoon by a neighbor who came to check on him. Quill had nailed his windows shut weeks earlier to keep dust out during the wind. With the windows sealed and the door closed, his cabin had become a box. The heat inside was not measured. It did not need to be. The body told the story that the thermometer would have confirmed. 1 man dead, 1 cave open, 1 thermometer reading 47 degrees above the sawdust, while the world outside blistered and cracked, and the sky stayed white, and the wind stayed gone, and the only mercy in Chautauqua County was a dark room in a limestone hill that an old man had bought for $10 and filled with winter because he remembered what his father had taught him about keeping cold alive. The inner door stayed locked that night. Anson sat outside the cave in the dark and listened to the heat insects singing in the dead grass. His porch thermometer read 91 degrees at 10 in the evening, 91 at 10 at night. The relief that darkness should have brought had not arrived. The earth had stored so much heat that it was giving it back through the night, the same way the cave was giving back cold, slowly, steadily, without mercy or opinion. Anson flexed his bad knee. It ached in the heat the same way it ached in the cold, which meant it simply ached, and the weather was incidental to the complaint. He thought about Rowan's words. Every opening spends cold, every door is withdrawal. The bank is not infinite. He had started with 186 blocks, plus broken chunks. Roughly 30 tons of ice buried under 4 feet of sawdust in a chamber that stayed 44 degrees before the ice was added and 41 degrees after. 6 months of sealed darkness, metered drainage, still air, and the patient insulation of dry sawdust and prairie hay. The ice had melted. It was always melting, but the melt rate was slow enough that the mass remaining was still enormous, still cold, still capable. But the heat was not finished. July was not finished. And the people who had stood in line that day would be back tomorrow and the day after, and every day that the sky stayed white and the wind stayed dead and the world above the cave continued to forget what cold felt like. Anson closed his eyes. Inside the hill, the thermometer read 47 degrees. It was the most valuable number in the county, and it belonged to a man who had bought it for $10 and a winter's worth of pain. The question was no longer whether the cave worked. The question was whether Anson could protect the cold without looking cruel. The heat broke on the 14th of July, not gently. A line of thunderstorms came from the northwest at dusk, and the temperature dropped 31 degrees in 2 hours. Rain fell so hard that the Big Caney rose 4 feet overnight and scoured its banks clean of the cracked mud and dead algae that had lined them for weeks. People stood on porches and let the rain hit their faces and did not go inside. The sound of it on the roofs was the sound of something returning that had been taken without permission. By morning, the county began to count its losses. 11 cattle dead on the Brannock Ranch, 23 chickens dead across 6 farms, Ephraim Quill dead in his sealed cabin, 1 milk cow dead behind the livery, bloated in the sun before the rain came. Crops that had been marginal before the scorcher were now finished, corn shriveled to brown stalks, gardens baked to dust. The damage was done. The heat had taken what it wanted, and the rain was not an apology. It was just water. But inside the cave on the hill, the thermometer read 47 degrees, the same as it had read when the crisis began. Thales. The first Sunday after the heat broke, Dr. Fenner Ladd stood on the steps of the Cedar Vale Church and said something that no one in town had heard him say in 30 years of medical practice. He said he had been wrong. He did not say it casually. Ladd was not a man who handled error with grace. He handled it with the same blunt precision he applied to a bone that needed setting. Acknowledge the break, reduce it, splint it, move on. I told Anson Pritchard that cold caves cure nothing, Ladd said. I told him men die from hunger, thirst, and fever, and that he could not eat darkness. I was correct about the hunger and the thirst. I was wrong about the darkness. He paused. The congregation sat in the pews with the particular stillness of people who are watching a man do something difficult and doing him the courtesy of not making it harder. My niece Clara was brought into that cave with a body temperature that I could not reduce with any tool available to me, while water was warm. Wet cloths dried in minutes. I had no ice. Ransom Peel had no ice. The railroad had no ice within 50 miles. Anson Pritchard had ice because he had spent his last dollar and his last winter putting it there. Lad looked at the floor. I owe him an apology. The science owed him a hearing. I did not give it. He sat down. The church was quiet. Then Martha Dooling, sitting in the third pew with her ledger on her lap, because she always had her ledger on her lap, said, Amen, and that was the end of that. But it was not the end. Lad's public admission was a key turning in a lock that had been stuck for months. The authority skeptic, the man whose credentials had given Peel's rumors weight, whose dismissal had made the town comfortable in its mockery, had reversed himself in front of witnesses. The permission structure of doubt collapsed. If the doctor said the cave worked, and anyone who had laughed at Anson Pritchard now had to reckon with the fact that their laughter had almost cost a 6-year-old girl her life. They did not reckon with it openly. People rarely do, but the reckoning showed in other ways. The farmer who had refused to lend Anson a plow blade in February brought a sack of oats for Button without being asked. The sawmill foreman who had demanded cash for sawdust left 3 sacks at the cave entrance with a note that said only no charge. The woman who had whispered at church that old grief had ruined Anson's judgment brought a pie to the cave and left it on the flat rock near the entrance where Martha had once left salt pork, and she did not sign her name because the pie was not generosity. It was penance. Sacro, Martha Dooling's conversion had been private, built across months of temperature checks and sawdust deliveries, and the steady accumulation of evidence that a practical woman requires before she commits to anything. But now, Martha made her conversion public. She arrived at the cave the day after Lad's church speech with her ledger, a pencil, and a list of questions that she had been writing down since February. I need to understand the system, she said. Anson was sitting on a stump near the entrance, soaking his knee in a bucket of cool cave water. Rowan was inside the vestibule, checking the door seals that the crowds had loosened during the crisis. The 2 old men looked at each other. Rowan shrugged, which meant the decision belonged to Anson. Anson walked Martha through the cave. Not the inner chamber, the ice was still too valuable to open the door for education, but the vestibule, the outer passage, the drainage trench visible through the gap in the floor. He showed her how the double doors worked. He showed her the thermometer board with Rowan's penciled numbers tracking the temperature from March through July. He explained why dry sawdust worked and wet hay failed, why still air held cold and moving air spent it, why the raised threshold kept cold from pouring out at ankle height. Martha took notes. She did not ask rhetorical questions or express wonder. She asked operational questions. How thick was the sawdust on the sides? How often did the drain need clearing? How many blocks could the chamber hold at maximum? What happened to the sawdust when it absorbed too much moisture? You are not asking how it works, Anson said. You're asking how to build another one. I am asking how to build 12, Martha said. She meant it. Within the week, Martha had drawn up plans for household ice pits, simplified versions of the cave system that could be built in existing cellars, wells, and dugouts using the same principles. Dry sawdust, sealed lids, drainage, shade. She brought the plans to 3 farm wives and 2 men who had used Anson's cave during the scorcher. She did not credit herself. She credited the physics, which she had learned from a man who had learned it from his father, who had learned it from cutting ice on a river in Maine. Anson held back the deeper details of the cave itself, the inner chamber layout, the specific stacking geometry, the airflow management that Rowan had taught him. Not out of greed, out of caution. The heat was not finished. Summer was not finished. And if the cave became a public attraction instead of a managed resource, the ice would not survive August. Teach them what they can build at home. Anson told Martha. Save the cave for what only the cave can do. The entry charge had been Rowan's idea. Anson had resisted it. You cannot give cold away forever, Rowan had said the evening after the scorcher broke. You have 40 cents and a mule. The sawdust needs replacing. The doors need repair. The drain needs clearing. Cold is work, and work costs money, and a man who gives away everything he has built is not generous. He is extinct. Anson charged 1 cent for healthy adults who wanted to cool down, 5 cents for merchants storing perishable goods. Children entered free. The sick entered free. Pregnant women entered free. The elderly entered free. The fee was not a price for cold. It was a price for convenience, the way a ferry charges not for the water, but for the crossing. Peel, predictably, called Anson a profiteer. He said it at Dooling's store, loud enough for the men at the counter to hear. The old man charges for air that God put inside a hill. He's no different from me, except I have a proper building and he has a hole. Martha was behind the counter. She did not look up from the ledger. You charged 25 cents for a fist-sized piece of ice on the 9th of July, she said. Anson charged nothing for the people who actually needed it. The merchants pay for shelf space. That is commerce. What you did was something else. Peel left the store without buying what he had come for. Martha continued writing in the ledger. The exchange was over in 30 seconds, but the men at the counter repeated it at the livery, and the livery repeated it at the saloon. And by evening the story had the clean, durable shape of something that would be told for years. The storekeeper's sister had called the ice merchant a gouger to his face, and he had walked away without a word. The measurable results accumulated through the rest of July and into August. Sick-room cloths cooled in cave water, reduced fevers faster than anything Lad had available in his own office. Butter stored in the outer chamber stayed firm overnight, which meant farm wives no longer lost a morning's churning to afternoon heat. Milk from 3 farms lasted into the second day when kept in crocks near the outer wall, which meant children drank milk in August instead of going without. The butcher, who had lost half his stock during the scorcher, saved a side of beef by hanging it in the vestibule after paying Anson's merchant fee. The beef lasted 4 days. 4 days in July. It was not a miracle. It was insulation, drainage, and 2 doors, but it felt like one. Farmers began asking how to build smaller versions. Could a well shaft work? Could a dugout cellar work? Could a shaded pit packed with sawdust and covered with canvas hold ice through August? Anson answered each question with the specificity that comes from understanding principles rather than memorizing steps. A well shaft could work if the ice was packed tight and the sawdust was dry, and the cover sealed completely. A dugout cellar could work if it was deep enough that the earth provided steady temperature and the drainage led downhill. A shaded pit was the weakest option because canvas breathed, sun shifted, and rain turned sawdust to paste. But even the weakest option was better than nothing, and nothing was what most families had. Rowan and Anson argued the way men argue who respect each other too much for politeness. The argument was always the same argument, dressed in different clothes. Rowan wanted the cave managed tighter, fewer entries, longer intervals between openings, temperature logs reviewed every morning, no exceptions for anyone who was not sick or a child, regardless of how hot it was or how long they had waited. The ice was finite. Every degree of warming was a withdrawal from a bank that took an entire winter to fill. Anson wanted mercy. He saw the faces at the entrance. He saw the old women whose cabins were unbearable. He saw the farmhands who could not work in the heat and could not afford to stop. He wanted the door open wider, longer, for more people. Mercy without order melts, Rowan said. They were sitting in the vestibule just inside the outer door, where the air was cool enough to think clearly. Rowan's cough had gotten worse. It came in fits now, not single barks, but long sequences that left him breathless and gray-faced. Order without mercy is just peel with colder walls, Anson replied. Rowan looked at him with the expression of a man who recognizes a good line and resents it. Then find the place between them and stand there, but stand there with the doors closed. They compromised. Morning hours for the sick and elderly, afternoon hours for merchants and storage, evening hours for families who needed relief. The inner door stayed closed, except for temperature checks and medical emergencies. The outer chamber, cooled by proximity rather than direct contact with the ice, provided most of the benefit. The inner chamber was the reserve, the vault, the cold that would carry them through if the heat returned. Rowan taught Anson to read the ice by sound. He tapped the sawdust surface with a broom handle and listened. A solid thump meant the ice below was intact. A hollow sound meant a void where ice had melted and the sawdust had collapsed inward. A wet sound meant the drainage was failing somewhere. Each morning, Rowan tapped his way across the pile like a man reading the pulse of something large and sleeping. "You do not need me for this," Rowan said one morning in early August. His voice was thin. The cough had settled into his chest like a tenant who intended to stay. "You have the ear for it now." "I need you for the doors," Anson said. "The doors are fitted. They do not need a foreman." "Then I need you for the argument. No one else tells me when I am wrong." Rowan smiled. It was not a large smile. Rowan did not deal in large smiles. It was the kind of smile that a man gives when he has been paid a compliment that he knows is also true, and the truth of it is both flattering and sad, because it means he is still needed, and being needed when your body is failing is a gift that carries its own weight. The worst heat broke in late July, but August brought its own cruelties. The air stayed hot, not scorcher hot, but 95, 98, a relentless baking that wore people down the way water wears stone. Rowan's cough deepened. Ladd examined him in the cave vestibule and told Anson what Anson already knew. "His lungs are filling," Ladd said. "The damp air in the cave is not helping, but the heat outside would be worse. He is in the place that is least bad for him, which is not the same as a place that is good." Anson asked what could be done. Ladd said what doctors say when the answer is nothing useful: rest, fluids, shade, and time. Time was the one commodity that Rowan did not have in surplus. Rowan refused to leave the cave, not because he was stubborn, although he was, because the doors still needed fitting. The left hinge on the inner door had loosened from the constant opening and closing during the scorcher. The burlap seals needed replacing. The drainage trench had silted near the exit crack and needed clearing. These were small tasks. A healthy man could have finished them in an afternoon. Rowan finished them over the course of a week, working in short intervals broken by long rests on a cot that Anson had built from fence planks and a folded horse blanket. He died on the 23rd of August, after the worst heat had passed and the nights had begun to carry the first faint suggestion that autumn was a concept the calendar had not abandoned entirely. He died on the cot in the vestibule, where the air was cool and the sound of the meltwater trickling through the drain he had taught Anson to cut was steady and quiet and close. Anson found him in the morning. Rowan's hands were folded on his chest, which meant he had known it was coming and had arranged himself with the same precision he had applied to every doorframe and drainage slope and stacking pattern. His face was calm. His eyes were closed. His coat was buttoned to the collar because Rowan Tate was a man who believed that a foreman should be presentable even when the shift was over. On the inner door frame, just above the chalk marks where Anson had written "Cold Falls, Water Leaves." "Men remember," Rowan had added 3 words in his own hand, "sometime in the night." The letters were small and shaky, written by hands that had finally lost the negotiation with stillness. The 3 words were, "Doors stay shut." Anson stood in the vestibule for a long time. The cool air moved around him like water around a stone. The meltwater ticked through the drain. The thermometer on the wall read 49 degrees, which was 2 degrees warmer than it had been at the peak of the crisis, which meant the ice was melting, which meant the vault was spending, which meant time was doing what time always does. The cave did not care that Rowan was dead. The physics did not mourn. The sawdust, and the ice, and the limestone, and the raised threshold, and the double doors, and the drainage trench lined with flat stone, all of it continued to function exactly as designed, because design does not require the designer to be alive. It only requires that someone once understood the principles well enough to build them into the walls. Anson buried Rowan on the hillside above the cave, in a spot where the limestone broke through the grass and the view reached south toward the caney bottoms. He carved the headstone himself from a flat piece of the same rock that formed the cave walls. He did not write much. Rowan Tate, St. Louis. He kept cellars cold. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. If this story reminds you that the people who build things for others do not always live to see the full harvest, share it with someone who has ever built something that outlasted them. The secondary crisis came in September, and it came fast. A freight wagon carrying fever medicine and a side of beef for a harvest crew overturned on the Cedar Vale Road 8 miles east of town. The axle snapped on a rut, and the wagon went sideways into a ditch. The driver broke his collarbone. The medicine, 3 bottles of quinine and a tin of willow bark powder, survived the crash but sat in the sun for 4 hours before anyone found them. The beef, which had been packed in straw and was already marginal after 2 days on the road, was hours from spoiling. A replacement wagon was 2 days away. The harvest crew needed the medicine because 3 men had come down with the intermittent fever that plagued the creek bottoms in late summer. The beef was the crew's only meat for the week. If it spoiled, 30 men worked on cornbread and beans, and men who work 16-hour harvest days on cornbread and beans do not work them for long. Martha brought the news to Anson at the cave. Anson looked at the medicine. He looked at the beef. He looked at the thermometer on the vestibule wall, which read 51 degrees, warmer than it had been, but still cooler than any other enclosed space in the county. He had not opened the inner door since Rowan's death. The last temperature check, 3 days earlier, had read 49 degrees inside the chamber. The sawdust was holding. The drainage was clear. But every opening spent cold, and Rowan's final words on the door frame were not a suggestion. Anson opened the outer door. He placed the medicine on a stone shelf near the vestibule wall, where the air was coolest. He did not open the inner door. The vestibule temperature, 51 degrees was sufficient to preserve quinine and willow bark. The medicine did not need to be frozen. It needed to not bake. The beef was a harder problem. 51 degrees would slow spoilage, but not stop it. The beef needed to be colder. It needed the inner chamber. Anson stood at the inner door and put his hand on the latch and heard Rowan's voice in his memory, clear as the chalk on the frame. Doors stay shut. But Rowan had also said something else, months earlier, in a different argument. He had said that cold without purpose was just temperature, the same way a tool without a hand was just metal. The cave existed to preserve. If it could not preserve when preservation was needed, it was a monument to engineering and nothing more. Anson opened the inner door. He hung the beef from a rope loop on a nail he drove into the ceiling near the outer edge of the chamber, well away from the ice pile. He closed the door. The total time open was less than 2 minutes. He checked the thermometer. 49 degrees. The opening had cost nothing measurable. He assigned Martha to keep a log. Who entered? When? How long the doors stayed open? what was stored and where. Martha wrote it all in the ledger with the same hand that tracked Dooling's inventory, and the cave acquired the structure that Rowan had wanted, and the mercy that Anson had demanded, recorded in ink on paper that would survive longer than either of them. The medicine reached the harvest crew the next morning, cool and intact. The beef lasted 3 days in the inner chamber before being retrieved, still firm, still safe. The crew foreman sent Anson 20 cents and a note that said, "Meat was good. Men are working. Thank you." 20 cents. It was more than the beef was worth to Anson. It was less than the beef was worth to 30 men. Somewhere between those two numbers was the economy that Anson was building, not the economy of monopoly, where one man sets the price because no one else has cold, but the economy of utility, where cold goes where it is needed, and the payment covers the cost of keeping it. Peel did not see it that way. Peel saw a man who had spent $10 on a cave and was now charging for something that Peel considered his market. The fact that Peel's market had failed during the scorcher, that his railroad ice had melted, his cold room had baked, and his customers had gone to Anson's cave instead, did not soften his position. It hardened it. A man whose monopoly fails does not accept the failure. He attacks the replacement. In early September, Peel filed a complaint with the county clerk. He argued that Anson was operating an unlicensed public cellar. He cited a territorial statute, vague and rarely enforced, that required any building used for commercial storage of perishable goods to be inspected and approved by the county health officer. The health officer was Dr. Ladd, which created a complication that Peel had not anticipated, or perhaps had anticipated and believed he could work around because Ladd's previous dismissal of the cave might still carry weight even after his public reversal. Peel was wrong about that. But he was not wrong about the statute. It existed. It applied. And if the county enforced it, Anson would need to submit the cave for inspection, pay a filing fee he could not afford, and potentially be shut down while the paperwork moved through the clerk's office at whatever speed the clerk preferred. Anson learned about the filing from Martha, who learned about it from her brother, who learned about it from Peel himself, standing at the counter of Dooling's store with a copy of the complaint and the expression of a man who has found a weapon that does not require him to be right, only to be persistent. "He cannot win this," Martha said, "but he can slow you down. And if the cave is closed for inspection during the next hot spell, people will remember that it was not there when they needed it." Anson sat on the stump outside the cave and looked at the hill and thought about Rowan, who had said that cold without purpose was just temperature, and about his father, who had said that ice did not need to be made twice if a man knew how to keep it, and about Peel, who understood nothing about cold except that it could be sold. "Then we do not let him close it," Anson said. "We let them inspect it. We let Ladd inspect it. And we let the county see what Peel is protecting, not public health, but private profit." The hearing was set for October. The cave stayed open through September. The ice continued to melt, slowly, steadily, the way it had been melting since March. The thermometer read 51 degrees in the inner chamber by the end of September, 10 degrees warmer than it had been in March, but still cold enough to preserve food, cool the sick, and store medicine. The sawdust was thinner. The drainage ran slower. The ice mass was perhaps half of what it had been in February, but half was enough. Half was more than Peel had. Half was more than anyone else in the county had. And in 6 weeks, the river would start to freeze again, and the cycle could begin once more, cutting, hauling, stacking, burying, sealing, waiting. The cave would refill. The cold would return. The only question was whether the town would protect the man who had built it, or whether Peel's paper complaint would accomplish what Peel's rumor and Peel's sawdust embargo and Peel's bribe attempt had not. Anson did not know the answer. He oiled the door hinges. He cleared the drainage trench. He tapped the sawdust surface with a broom handle and listened for the sound of solid ice beneath, a sound that Rowan had taught him to hear, and that he now heard with ears that belonged to a man who had lost his teacher and kept his lessons. The cave held, the hearing approached, and somewhere in Cedar Vale, Ransom Peale sharpened his argument the way a man sharpens a blade, not because the blade was dull, but because the sharpening made him feel like he was doing something. The county hearing took place on the 11th of October, 1890, in the same clerk's office where Anson had bought the cave 9 months earlier. The coal stove was lit against the autumn chill. The same chairs that had been reserved for bidders with money were now filled with people who had come to watch a man defend a hole in a hill. Ransom Peale arrived first. He wore a pressed coat and carried a folder of papers that included the territorial statute, a copy of his complaint, and a handwritten list of concerns that he had organized under headings like a man who believed that headings made arguments more convincing. He sat in the front row and arranged his papers on his knee and did not look at anyone. Anson arrived second, walking slowly because his knee had stiffened in the cool weather, and because he had never been a man who hurried toward situations that other people controlled. He wore the same coat he had worn to the auction. Martha Dooling walked beside him, carrying the ledger. The room filled. Anton and Jarek Molina stood along the back wall because the chairs were taken. Dr. Ladd sat near the window with his medical bag on the floor beside him, the way a soldier sits near his weapon even in peacetime. The farmer who had lent the plow blade, the sawmill foreman, the woman who had brought the pie, the harvest crew foreman who had driven 12 miles to be present, families whose children had cooled in the cave during the scorcher, men who had stood in line with their hats in their hands and waited for the door to open. Peale had expected the hearing to be administrative, a clerk, a statute, a ruling. He had not expected an audience. The county clerk, a man named Orville Sprague, who had held the position for 11 years and intended to hold it for 11 more, read the complaint aloud. The language was dry. Unlicensed public cellar, commercial storage of perishable goods, territorial statute requiring inspection and approval, filing fee of $3, potential closure pending review. Sprague asked Peale to state his case. Peale stood. He was not a nervous man. He had negotiated freight contracts, argued with railroad agents, and set ice prices in rooms full of angry customers. But the room was wrong. The audience was wrong. The faces watching him were not the faces of men weighing a legal argument. They were the faces of people who remembered July. "The statute is clear," Peale said. "Any structure used for commercial storage of perishable goods must be inspected and approved. Pritchard has been charging for entry and storage since July. He has not applied for inspection. He is operating outside the law." Sprague nodded. He turned to Anson. "Mr. Pritchard, do you wish to respond?" Anson stood. He did not have papers. He did not have headings. He had the ledger, which Martha opened to the first page and held where the clerk could see it. "I charge 1 cent for healthy adults who want to cool down," Anson said. 5 cents for merchants storing goods. Children are free. The sick are free. The elderly are free. Pregnant women are free. The total collected since July is $4.37. The total spent on sawdust, nails, burlap, and door lumber is $6.12. Martha Dooling has kept the record. The cave has operated at a loss of $1.75. The room was quiet. The arithmetic was simple enough that every person present could verify it in their heads. $4.37 collected. $6.12 spent. A loss. The man Peale had called a profiteer had spent more on maintaining the cave than he had earned from running it. Sprague looked at the ledger. He looked at Peale. "Mr. Peale, you described this as a commercial operation." "It charges for entry," Peale said. That is commerce. It charges 1 cent, Sprague said, and exempts most of the people who use it. What do you charge for ice, Mr. Peel? Peel's jaw tightened. My prices reflect market conditions. On the 9th of July, Martha said, without being asked and without standing, because Martha Dooling did not require permission from a county clerk to state a fact, Ransom Peel sold ice at 25 cents per pound to the hotel and saloons. When families with sick children came to his cold room that afternoon, he had none left. Anson Pritchard opened his cave to 37 people that day. He charged nothing. The sick and children entered free. They entered free every day after. Peel turned in his chair. I am not on trial here. Neither is Anson, Martha said. The room rippled, not laughter, something quieter than laughter and sharper. Agreement. Dr. Ladd stood without being asked. He did not wait for Sprague to recognize him. He simply stood, the way a man stands when he has something to say that outweighs procedure. My niece Clara collapsed with heat fever on the 9th of July, Ladd said. Her body temperature was dangerous. I had no ice. Mr. Peel had no ice. The railroad had no ice within 50 miles. I carried Clara to Anson Pritchard's cave because I had no other option. The cave air was 47 degrees. I cooled her with cloths dipped in cave meltwater. Her temperature dropped. Her pulse stabilized. She recovered. Ladd paused. He looked at Peel with the steady gaze of a man who has weighed a life against a statute and found the statute inadequate. If that cave had been closed for inspection on the 9th of July, I believe Clara would have died. I am stating that as a medical opinion, not as family sentiment. The room was still. Sprague wrote something in his notes. Peel looked at the papers on his knee and did not look up. Sprague asked if there were other statements. The harvest crew foreman said the cave had preserved medicine and meat that would have spoiled without it. Anton Molina said, in halting English, that his brother helped finish, that Anson had fixed their wagon without payment, and that they had helped haul ice without belief, but belief was not required for the ice to work. The farmer who had lent the plow blade said he had refused to help in February and regretted it. Sprague closed his notebook. He looked at Peel. He looked at Anson. He said, The statute requires inspection of commercial storage facilities. I am not satisfied that this operation is commercial. I am directing the county health officer to inspect the cave at his convenience. Dr. Ladd, you are the county health officer. Please inspect the cave and file a report. Ladd nodded. I have been inside the cave. The drainage is sound, the temperature is steady. The air is clean. I will file my report this afternoon. My recommendation will be approval. Sprague looked at Peel one more time. Mr. Peel, your complaint is noted. The inspection will proceed. If Dr. Ladd approves the facility, the matter is closed. Peel gathered his papers. He stood. The folder was neat. The headings were clear, and the argument was exactly as strong as it had been when he walked in. But the argument had never been the point. The point had been to shut down a cave that threatened his business, and the cave was not going to be shut down, and every person in the room knew it, and Peel knew that they knew it, and the knowledge sat on his shoulders like a weight that no amount of headings could redistribute. He walked out of the clerk's office without speaking. He passed through the same door that Anson had entered 9 months earlier, with a tobacco tin full of coins and a plan that no one understood. The door closed behind him. Anson did not watch him go. The humiliation was not the hearing. The humiliation was what came after. Peel's railroad ice continued to arrive through the rest of the summer and into the fall, but the customers who had depended on him exclusively now had an alternative. The butcher stored meat in Anson's cave at 5 cents a day instead of buying ice from Peel at 20 cents a pound. Farm wives who had paid Peel for small chunks to keep milk fresh now packed their own sawdust boxes using plans that Martha had drawn on brown paper and distributed at the store. The hotel still bought from Peel, but it negotiated the price down because Peel's monopoly was broken and both parties knew it. Peel did not go bankrupt. He did not leave town. He did not have a dramatic collapse. He simply became less necessary, which for a man who had built his identity on being the only source of something essential was a diminishment worse than failure. Failure could be blamed on circumstances. Irrelevance could only be blamed on someone else doing the job better. By December, Peel's cold room sat empty most days. He still received railroad shipments, but smaller ones, and he sold them at 10 cents a pound, the price he had charged in mild summers, before the heat gave him permission to gouge. It was a fair price. It had always been a fair price. The heat had simply revealed what fairness meant when the alternative was a man with a cave and a 1-cent entry fee. Peel and Anson never spoke again directly. The town was small enough that they passed each other on the road and in the store, and the silence between them was not hostility, but the particular emptiness that exists between a man who lost a monopoly and the man who broke it. Peel did not apologize. Anson did not gloat. The river froze in December, and Anson walked to the bank to check the ice thickness, and Peel watched him from the road, and neither man acknowledged the other, and that was the resolution. Not a confrontation, not a conversion, but a quiet rearrangement of who mattered in Cedar Vale and why. The first organized ice harvest happened in January of 1891, and it looked nothing like Anson's solitary war against the river the previous winter. Martha organized it. She had spent the fall drawing up plans, assigning tasks, and convincing 12 families that spending 3 days cutting ice was an investment that would pay off in July when their children were not sick, and their milk was not sour, and their meat was not dangerous. She was persuasive not because she was eloquent, but because she was specific. She told each family exactly how much ice they needed, exactly how much sawdust to gather, exactly how deep to dig their cellar pits, and exactly what would go wrong if they used damp insulation or forgot to slope the drainage. Anson supervised the cutting. He stood on the bank of the Big Caney with his iron saw and his scored grid lines and showed men half his age how to read ice thickness by the color. Blue-black for 10 inches, blue-gray for 8, gray for 6, gray-white for 4, and anything lighter than that was not worth cutting because it would crack before you got it out of the water. He showed them how to score straight lines by dragging a weighted blade along a plank laid flat on the surface. He showed them how to lever a block free without cracking the adjacent blocks, using the tongs at a low angle and pulling toward the body, not away. The children helped. They carried sacks of dry sawdust from the mill, which now gave it freely because the mill owner had spent one afternoon in Anson's cave during the September heat, and decided that goodwill was more valuable than 3 cents a sack. Boys dragged sawdust on sleds. Girls stacked burlap. A 12-year-old named Hetty Brannock kept a tally of blocks cut on a slate that Martha had given her, and she took the job seriously enough that grown men checked with her before loading. The Molina brothers hauled. They had 2 wagons now, the repaired one and a second they had bought with harvest wages, and they moved blocks at a pace that made Anson's solitary trips with Button look like a memory from a slower century. Anton sang check work songs while he drove, and the rhythm of the songs matched the rhythm of the loading, and the blocks moved from river to cave to cellar pit in a chain that did not break for 3 days. Anson watched from the bank. His knee would not let him stand on the ice anymore, and his hands, which had cracked and bled, and frozen and healed and cracked again the previous winter, were stiff enough that the saw handle felt wrong in his grip. He supervised. He corrected. He pointed with his cane a cottonwood branch that Martha had stripped and sanded smooth when a man scored a line crooked or levered a block too steeply. Button stood beside him on the bank, shifting her weight off her bad foreleg, watching the river with the patience of a mule who has seen it all before and found it unremarkable. The town filled the cave first, 220 blocks, more than Anson had managed alone, packed tight with thin sawdust between the rows and 4 feet of dry insulation on top and sides. Rowan's stacking geometry, Rowan's drainage trench, cleared and relined, Rowan's double doors, rehung with new hinges and fresh burlap seals. Everything Rowan had taught, applied by hands that Rowan had never touched, but had shaped through the old man who stood between them. Then the families filled their own pits. 3 farm cellars received ice for the first time. The schoolhouse cellar, a stone-walled room beneath the main floor that had been used for nothing except storing broken slates, received 40 blocks packed in sawdust that the children had gathered themselves. The butcher dug a new pit behind his shop and lined it with flat limestone the way Rowan had lined the cave trench, and he packed it with 80 blocks and covered it with hay and canvas and a wooden lid that fitted tight enough to keep the warm air guessing. Not every pit worked. The Brannock farm cellar was too shallow, and by May the ice had melted to a cold puddle that smelled of wet hay and disappointment. A dugout pit on the Hollis claim flooded after spring rain because the drainage led nowhere, and the sawdust turned to the paste that Rowan had warned about, and the ice vanished in 3 weeks. Martha noted both failures in her ledger and revised the plans. The Brannock cellar needed to be deeper. The Hollis pit needed a drainage outlet cut into the slope below. The principles did not change. The application needed refinement. Anson visited each failure personally. He did not lecture, he showed. He crouched beside the Brannock cellar and pointed to where the earth was warm, less than 3 feet down, where the surface temperature still reached the stored ice. And he said, 2 feet deeper. The earth gets colder as you go. Your father's father knew this. Ask the well digger. He stood beside the Hollis pit and traced the water line where the rain had entered and said, water goes downhill, your drain goes level. Cut it lower on the west side and the water will leave. Both families rebuilt. Both pits worked the following summer. The knowledge traveled not through books or newspapers, but through the specific physical experience of watching an old man point at a puddle and explain why it was there. Martha Dooling became the public face of the cave operation, not because Anson asked her to, but because Anson could not do what Martha could do, and Martha could not do what Anson could do, and the 2 capacities together were greater than either alone. Anson understood cold. He understood ice. He understood limestone and sawdust and drainage and the physics of heat transfer in enclosed spaces. He could look at a cellar and tell you whether it would hold ice through July or lose it by May. He could tap a sawdust pile and tell you by sound whether the ice beneath was solid or hollow. He could build doors that sealed and trenches that drained and thresholds that held cold air like a dam holds water. What he could not do was talk to people without making them feel that he was enduring their presence. Anson was not unkind. He was simply a man who had spent most of his adult life in the company of ice and mules, and neither of those required social grace. When families came to the cave asking questions, Anson answered with precision and economy and a complete absence of warmth, which made the answers useful and the experience of receiving them slightly uncomfortable. Martha could talk to anyone. She could explain the sawdust principle to a farm wife using kitchen language. Think of the sawdust as a quilt for the ice. You would not put a wet quilt on a sleeping child, and you should not put wet sawdust on sleeping ice. She could negotiate sawdust prices with the mill. She could schedule cave access so that families did not crowd the entrance and spend cold on confusion. She could record every entry, every temperature, every cent collected and spent in a ledger that would survive both of them. They did not discuss the arrangement. It simply assembled itself the way a house assembles around the people who live in it. The carpenter does the framing, the plasterer does the walls, and neither pretends to do the other's work. Martha kept the ledger, managed the schedule, distributed the plans, and spoke for the cave when speaking was required. Anson maintained the ice, the doors, the drainage, and the sawdust, and spoke for the cave when speaking was not required, which was most of the time. The partnership was not romantic. Anson was 64, widowed, stiff-kneed, and possessed of a temperament that made courtship unlikely and marriage implausible. Martha was 42, widowed, practical, and possessed of a clarity about her own needs that did not include an elderly man who lived in a cave. What they shared was not affection in the conventional sense. It was the recognition that each had something the other lacked, and that the combination produced results that neither could achieve alone. By the summer of 1891, the cave was no longer Anson's project. It was Cedar Vale's resource. Martha's plans had produced 7 functioning household ice pits, in addition to the cave itself and the schoolhouse cellar. The butcher's pit held through August. 2 farm cellars kept milk and butter cold enough to last 2 days instead of 1. The schoolhouse cellar became a refuge during the July heat, not as dramatic as the scorcher, but hot enough that children and the elderly benefited from an afternoon in 50-degree air. Anson still led the winter harvest every January. He stood on the bank with his cane and his iron saw, which he no longer used but refused to leave at the cave, because the saw had belonged to his father, and a man does not leave his father's tools behind when he goes to the river, and directed the cutting with the authority of a man who had done the job alone before anyone else believed it was worth doing. His knee worsened each year. By 1893, he could not walk to the river without stopping twice to rest. By 1895, he rode Button to the bank and supervised from the wagon seat. Button's bad foreleg had stiffened into a permanent limp that matched Anson's own, and the two of them sat together on the bank like a pair of veterans who had served in the same war and come home with the same wound. The stone cabin appeared in the spring of 1891. Men from the harvest crew built it on the flat ground above the cave entrance, using limestone pulled from the same hill that housed the ice. It had 2 rooms, one for sleeping, one for living, and a stove that drew well and a door that faced south so the winter sun warmed the threshold. Anson had not asked for it. The men had not asked his permission. They arrived one morning with tools and stone, and the particular determination of people who are repaying a debt that has no invoice. The cabin took a week. Anson moved in without ceremony. He hung the iron saw on the wall above the door, and the saw stayed there for the rest of his life. The years compress the way years do when the drama has passed, and what remains is the steady accumulation of days spent doing useful work. Anson taught. Not in the formal sense. He had no school, no students, no curriculum. He taught by standing beside a man's cellar pit and saying, "Deeper." He taught by tapping a sawdust pile and saying, "Hear that? Hollow. The ice is gone there. Replace the sawdust and pack it tight." He taught by pointing at a drainage trench and saying nothing, because the pooled water said it for him. Martha kept the records. By 1894, her ledger contained 4 years of temperature data: cave temperatures, cellar temperatures, outside temperatures, ice weights, sawdust depths, melt rates, drainage volumes. She did not know that she was compiling a data set. She knew that she was keeping accounts, because accounts were what Martha kept, and the fact that these particular accounts described the behavior of ice in limestone rather than the price of salt pork and calico did not change the fundamental act of writing down what was true. Dr. Ladd became the cave's medical advocate. He published a letter in the county paper arguing that every community in southern Kansas should maintain a cold shelter for heat emergencies. He cited Ephraim Quill's death and Clara's recovery in the same paragraph. and the juxtaposition was more persuasive than any argument he could have constructed. One man died in a sealed cabin. One child lived in an open cave. The difference was not luck. It was preparation. Clara grew up. She married a teacher from Sudan. She named her first daughter Nell, which was the name of Anson's dead wife. And Anson did not learn this until Martha told him. And when Martha told him, he sat on the stump outside the cave and said nothing for a long time. And Martha did not interrupt the nothing because she understood that some silences are not empty, but full. The cave operated every summer for the rest of Anson's life. Some years the ice lasted through September. Some years it was gone by August. The variables were winter severity, spring rain, summer heat, and the number of people who used the cave. And every year more people used it, which meant every year more ice was needed, which meant every year the January harvest grew. By 1895, 40 people worked the harvest. By 1898, the river cutting was the largest organized labor event in Chautauqua County outside of the fall cattle drive. Anson never became rich. The cave charged 1 cent. The cellar plans were free. The knowledge was given without condition. What Anson became was necessary. The man you asked when your cellar failed, the man you watched when the harvest started, the man whose cane tapped the ice, and whose ear told him whether the cold was holding or the cold was leaving. He lived in the stone cabin above the cave. He ate simply. He read little. He talked to Button, who lived to an age that surprised everyone, including the mule, and who died in the spring of 1897 in the thin grass outside the cave entrance, in the same spot where Anson had hobbled her on the day he bought the deed. Anson died in January of 1901 in the stone cabin in his bed, while the river below was freezing hard enough for another harvest. Martha found him in the morning. His hands were folded, the way Rowan's had been, and the stove had gone cold, and the iron saw hung on the wall above the door where it had hung for 10 years, and the light through the south-facing window touched the blade the way winter light touches metal, briefly and without warmth, and with complete indifference to what the metal remembers. Martha closed his eyes. She walked down the hill to the cave. She opened the outer door, then the inner door, and stood in the cold dark beside 30 tons of river ice buried under 4 feet of sawdust, and she read the thermometer by the light of a candle. 44 degrees, the same as the first winter, the same as always. She closed both doors. She walked to town. The harvest would continue without him. The cold would hold. The doors would stay shut. Within 2 winters of Anson's death, 3 farms, the schoolhouse, the butcher's shed, and a new public cellar near the church all operated ice storage built on the principles he had taught. Not every pit worked perfectly. The Hollis claim lost 1/3 of its ice one summer when a child left the lid open for an hour. A farm south of the Caney flooded its cellar by draining uphill, a mistake so elementary that Martha wrote it in the ledger underlined twice. But the principle held: shade, still air, dry insulation, drainage, and doors that did not spill cold. 12 families stored ice by 1902. By 1905, 23. Anson Pritchard lived the rest of his years on the cave lot he bought for $10 at a sheriff's sale in January of 1890. He never left Chautauqua County. He never paid off the freight judgment entirely. Martha made arrangements with the court to reduce it, and the remaining balance was forgiven after the county hearing, on the grounds that a man who had built a public cooling shelter had contributed more than $31 in civic value. He died in winter, not in the cave but in the stone cabin above it, while the river below was freezing hard enough for the harvest he would not lead. Ransom Peale had said it in February, sitting his horse outside the cave with the confidence of a man who believed his own monopoly was physics. In July, ice belongs to the man who still has it. He was right. He had simply misunderstood who that man would be. On the 9th of July, 1890, when the porch thermometer read 112 degrees and the wind was dead, and a girl named Clara lay on a blanket in a dark chamber with cold cloths on her wrists, the man who still had ice was Anson Pritchard, 64 years old, bad knee, lame mule, $10 deed, and a winter's worth of river frozen inside a hill because his father had taught him that coal did not need to be made twice if a man knew how to keep it. The cave door closed against the July light. Sawdust dusted the threshold. Children sat in the dim outer chamber while their mothers held cool cloths to their wrists. And the dark held winter because one man had carried it there, block by block, through a season when no one believed the carrying was worth the wait.